They say hindsight is 20/20ths, don't they? Imagine being so sure you're winning, you laugh off the very thing that could spell your doom. What if the enemy's secret weapon wasn't so secret, just underestimated? A story of fatal pride before the fall. Before radar became the game changer we know, early detection was clumsy, almost laughable. So, why did it still matter so much? History often turns on moments of quiet invention, moments easily missed or even mocked by those who think they hold all the cards. We talk a lot about the big, flashy weapons of World War II, the tanks, the planes, the bombs. But sometimes, the most decisive battles are fought not with brute force, but with whispers in the ether, with faint signals bouncing off metal wings in the dark. The story of early detection technology, particularly radar before the invention of the cavity magnetron, is one such tale. It's a story of desperate ingenuity, of making do with what you have, and crucially, it's a story of how deadly arrogance can be. Because while the Allies were scrambling to build a shield, however imperfect, against the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring and many in the Nazi high command looked at these fledgling efforts, these strange masts and flickering screens, and they laughed. They saw toys, not threats. They couldn't imagine that these crude contraptions could seriously challenge their seemingly invincible air power. What happened because of that laughter? What were the consequences of underestimating an enemy scrambling in the dark, armed with little more than wire, vacuum tubes, and sheer desperation? That's the story we need to uncover. It wasn't just about blips on a screen, it was about lives saved, battles turned, and the slow, grinding realization by a confident enemy that perhaps they should have paid more attention. Let's step back for a moment, to a time before the sleek radar domes we might picture today, even before the pocket-sized power of the cavity magnetron. That would truly revolutionize radar later in the war. We need to go back to the 1930s, a period simmering with tension across Europe, where scientists in several countries were quietly, almost independently, wrestling with a fundamental question: could you use radio waves to see things beyond the horizon, things hidden by distance, darkness, or clouds? It sounds simple now, doesn't it? We live in a world saturated with wireless signals. But back then, it was frontier science. In Britain, a team led by Robert Watson Watt was tasked with a seemingly impossible challenge: could they create a death ray using radio waves to cook pilots in their cockpits or disable engines? Thankfully, Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins quickly calculated that the energy required would be immense, completely impractical. But Wilkins had a thought, a crucial pivot. While they couldn't project enough energy to destroy an aircraft, perhaps they could project enough radio energy to bounce off one and detect its presence. It was a faint echo of an idea, building on earlier experiments by others, but it was the spark needed. This led to the famous Daintree experiment in February 1935. They used a BBC shortwave transmitter and a receiver set up a few miles away. As a Hayford bomber flew through the transmitted beam, the faint, reflected signal caused a visible flicker on their cathode ray tube screen. It wasn't much, just a wavering line. But it was proof. Proof that radio waves could indeed detect an aircraft at a distance. Imagine the quiet satisfaction in that cold field. They hadn't built a death ray, but they had found something potentially far more valuable: eyes that could pierce the clouds and the night. This wasn't happening in a vacuum, of course. Scientists in Germany, America, France, and elsewhere were exploring similar concepts. The Germans, in particular, had their own developments, like the Freya system. But the British approach, driven by the urgent need for air defense against a rapidly rearming Germany, took a unique path. Instead of focusing solely on high-precision, shorter-range systems initially, they made a bold, strategic choice. They decided to build a coastal chain, a network of massive transmitter and receiver towers stretching along the southern and eastern coasts of England. This became known as Chain Home. Now, Chain Home was, by later standards, incredibly crude. The transmitter towers, some over 350 feet tall, blasted out powerful, long-wavelength radio pulses across the English Channel. The receiver towers, equally imposing, would pick up the faint echoes bouncing off incoming aircraft. It wasn't pinpoint accurate. The long wavelengths meant the resolution was poor, it couldn't easily distinguish between a single large bomber and a tight formation of smaller planes. Determining the altitude of the planes was even trickier, often involving comparing signals from receivers at different heights on the towers and a fair bit of educated guesswork. It was slow, cumbersome, and operators needed extensive training and interpretation skills to make sense of the flickering patterns, known as blips, on their screens. You can almost picture the scene in those early radar huts, the dim light, the hum of electronics, the operators hunched over their screens, trying to decipher meaning from dancing green lines. They weren't seeing a neat map like we imagine today. They were interpreting raw data, calculating range based on the time delay of the echo, estimating bearing using directional antennas, and struggling to gauge height. It required skill, intuition, and constant cross-referencing. Information from multiple stations had to be collected, filtered, and plotted by hand on large maps in central filter rooms. This human element, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, operators and RAF filter officers working under immense pressure, was just as critical as the electronics themselves. They were the processors. The intelligence turning faint electronic whispers into actionable warnings. This whole system, chain home, was a massive, expensive undertaking, built in remarkable secrecy during the late 1930s. It was a gamble, a bet on an unproven technology. And it certainly had its flaws. So, here was Britain, pouring resources into this vast, clunky network of towers, while across the channel, the Luftwaffe was building the most formidable air force the world had ever seen. German intelligence was aware of the British towers, of course. Photos existed. But what did they make of them? Reports varied, but a prevailing attitude, certainly encouraged by Göring himself, was dismissive. Some thought they were part of a naval communication system. Others who suspected their true purpose vastly underestimated their capability. Why this confidence? Several factors were at play. Firstly, German radar development, like the Freya system, was in some ways technically more advanced in terms of operating at higher frequencies, offering better resolution, but it wasn't deployed as a cohesive, integrated early warning system in the same way chain home was. They hadn't grasped the strategic value of that broad, albeit imperfect, coastal coverage. Secondly, the Luftwaffe's doctrine was overwhelmingly offensive. Their focus was on blitzkrieg, on fast, overwhelming attacks. Defensive systems seemed secondary, almost an admission of weakness. Göring famously boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr. This offensive mindset blinded them to the potential impact of even a rudimentary defensive warning system. Think about it from their perspective, they had superior aircraft numbers, experienced pilots fresh from the Spanish Civil War, and a belief in their own technological and martial prowess. These strange British towers. They seemed like a desperate, perhaps even quaint, attempt by an island nation bracing for an inevitable blow. There are accounts, perhaps apocryphal but indicative, of the attitude of German pilots being told the masts were just part of a new navigation system, nothing to worry about. Some intelligence reports apparently concluded that the British system was too primitive to be effective, prone to errors, and easily jammed. And to be fair, it was prone to errors and jamming was a concern. But the core assumption, that it was therefore ineffective, was dangerously flawed. They laughed, perhaps not always literally out loud, but certainly in their strategic calculations. They underestimated the combination of technology, however imperfect, and a well-organized system of reporting and response. They failed to see that even a few minutes' warning could make all the difference. And that failure would soon have devastating consequences, not in some far-off future, but in the skies over Britain during the summer of 1940. The stage was set for the Battle of Britain, and the laughing was about to stop. Imagine the tension in Britain during the summer of 1940. France had fallen, and the island stood alone, bracing for the expected German invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Everyone knew the invasion could only succeed if the Luftwaffe gained air superiority, smashing the Royal Air Force into submission. Hermann Göring promised Hitler it would take only a few weeks, perhaps even days. The Luftwaffe began its assault, targeting coastal convoys, ports, and then, crucially, RAF airfields and infrastructure, including the chain home radar stations themselves. This was Adlertag, Eagle Day, and the days that followed, the height of the Battle of Britain. The German pilots flew with confidence, often in large formations, expecting to overwhelm the British defenses. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of finding British fighters on the ground, refueling or caught by surprise, Luftwaffe formations often found RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires already airborne, climbing to meet them at advantageous altitudes and positions. Surprise, a key element of the blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so well on the continent, was often lost. How was this possible? The answer lay in those flickering screens in the chain home huts and the intricate network behind them. Despite its limitations, chain home was providing that vital early warning. Even 15 or 20 minutes notice, the time it took for German bombers, assembling over France, to cross the Channel, was enough. It meant RAF Fighter Command, under the brilliant organization of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, didn't have to waste precious fuel and pilot fatigue on constant standing patrols. They could keep fighters on the ground, ready to scramble the moment radar detected incoming raids. Filter rooms collated reports from multiple stations, estimated the size, direction, and altitude of the enemy formations, and passed this crucial intelligence to sector controllers. These controllers then vectored their waiting squadrons to intercept the enemy, attempting to concentrate their limited fighter numbers against the main threats. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the height estimates were wrong. Sometimes formations were misidentified. Sometimes fighters were sent to the wrong place. But more often than not, it worked well enough. It allowed the RAF, though outnumbered, to meet the Luftwaffe on more favorable terms, to inflict crucial losses, and perhaps most importantly, to disrupt the rhythm and confidence of the attackers. German pilots started reporting encountering British fighters far earlier and in greater numbers than expected. Bomber crews found themselves under attack before even reaching their targets. The carefully planned German raids were often broken up, forcing bombers to jettison their loads early or turn back. The psychological impact was significant too. The sense of flying into a prepared defense, rather than striking a surprised enemy, began to wear down morale. Göring became increasingly frustrated. Why wasn't the RAF crumbling as predicted? He blamed his pilots, changed tactics, shifted targets, first from airfields to bombing London itself, the Blitz, a critical era that gave Fighter Command breathing room to repair and regroup. But a fundamental reason for the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority was their initial underestimation of that laughable radar system. They did attack the radar stations, sometimes successfully putting them temporarily out of action. But the towers were hard to destroy completely, repairs were often quick, and the network had built-in redundancy. Crucially, the Germans never fully committed to eliminating chain home as a primary, sustained objective, partly because they never fully grasped its pivotal role. They were still focused on the offensive, on destroying the RAF in the air or on the ground, not realizing that radar was the RAF's eyes, guiding its fists. If you find this look back at how technology, even imperfect technology, shaped history, consider subscribing. It helps us keep digging into these crucial stories. The Battle of Britain wasn't won solely by radar, of course. The skill and bravery of the pilots, the quality of the Spitfire and Hurricane, the leadership of Dowding, and critical production efforts all played vital roles. But chain home was the force multiplier. It allowed the RAF to fight smarter, not just harder. It turned a potential slaughter into a defensive victory that forced Hitler to postpone, and ultimately abandon, Operation Sea Lion. The Pre-Magnetron radar, the system the Nazis had underestimated, had proven its worth in the most critical test imaginable. The laughter had definitively stopped, replaced by frustration and mounting losses. However, the war in the air was far from over, and the limitations of chain home, particularly against a new kind of threat, would soon become painfully apparent, demanding yet more innovation. The Battle of Britain had been won in the daylight skies, thanks in large part to the early warning provided by chain home. But the Luftwaffe, unable to achieve air superiority by day, shifted its strategy. Starting in September 1940, London, and then other British cities, began to endure relentless night bombing, the Blitz. And this exposed a critical weakness in the existing defense system. Chain home, with its long wavelengths and fixed coastal antennas, was designed primarily for detecting incoming raids across the channel during the day. It could tell that bombers were coming, and roughly where they were headed, but it lacked the precision to guide night fighters directly to individual bombers in the vast darkness. Furthermore, once the bombers crossed the coast, the chain home stations looking out to sea were effectively blind. There was a secondary system, chain home low, CHL, operating on shorter wavelengths, which was better at detecting low-flying aircraft and even ships, but it too was mainly coastal. What Britain desperately needed was a way to track bombers inland and, crucially, a way for night fighters to see their targets in the dark. Imagine being a pilot in a Bristol Blenheim or a Beaufighter, scrambling into the night sky based on a vague report of bombers heading towards Coventry or Liverpool. You're flying blind, relying on eyesight, maybe catching a fleeting glimpse of exhaust flames or the silhouette of a Heinkel against moonlit clouds. Anti-aircraft guns might put up a barrage, but hitting a moving target at night was incredibly difficult. The bombers, often flying individually or in loose streams rather than tight formations, navigated using radio beams, like Nicobane and X-Gerat, and dropped their deadly payloads with relative impunity in the early months of the Blitz. The devastation on the ground was immense, and the pressure to find a solution was enormous. The existing radar network needed help. This led to the rapid development and deployment of ground-controlled interception, GCI. Radar stations. These were different from chain home. They used shorter wavelengths, often around 1.5 meters, and featured rotating antennas, allowing them to scan the sky inland and track both the bombers and the intercepting night fighters. Picture a GCI controller in a darkened room, watching two blips on their screen, one representing the enemy bomber, the other the friendly fighter. Their job was to provide precise instructions over the radio, guiding the fighter pilot step by step. Vector 270, climb Angel 5, target ahead, 5 miles, slightly starboard, steady now, you should be seeing him. It was a tense, demanding job, requiring immense concentration and clear communication. But even GCI had its limits. It could get the fighter close, maybe within a mile or two, but the final, crucial phase of the interception still often relied on the pilot's eyesight. And in the pitch black, finding another aircraft just a few hundred yards away was incredibly difficult. What was needed was radar on the fighter itself, airborne interception, AI, radar. Early AI sets, like the AI Mk4, were bulky, heavy, and temperamental. They consisted of multiple antennas sticking out from the aircraft's nose and wings, a transmitter, receiver unit, and separate display screens for the pilot and a dedicated radar operator. These early sets operated on similar wavelengths to GCI, around 1.5 meters, which meant the antennas had to be quite large, creating drag. The displays were rudimentary, showing blips that indicated range and relative bearing, left, right, above, below, but interpreting them required significant skill, especially amidst the clutter and interference. Think about the radar operator, crammed into the back of a Beaufighter, peering at the faint glow of the cathode ray tubes, trying to distinguish the echo of a Ju-88 from ground reflections or electronic noise, all while being bounced around in the night sky, communicating instructions to the pilot. It was pioneering work, fraught with technical challenges and danger. These early AI sets were far from perfect. Their range was limited, typically only a few miles. They were susceptible to ground clutter, making it hard to track low-flying targets. And the Germans eventually developed countermeasures, like Doppel, chaff, and electronic jammers, specifically designed to confuse these meter-wavelength radars. Yet, despite these flaws, AI radar, guided initially by GCI, began to score successes. Night fighter crews slowly learned how to use this new technology, developing tactics to close in on unseen targets. Aces like John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham became famous, though the nickname was deliberately misleading propaganda. His incredible night vision was actually the glow of the AI radar screen reflected in his eyes. The Nazis were initially slow to react effectively to the growing threat of night fighters equipped with AI radar. Their focus remained largely on offensive bombing technology and navigation aids. While they were aware of British radar developments, the complexity and effectiveness of the integrated GCI and AI system took time to appreciate fully. There was still a degree of complacency, a belief that their bombers could operate with relative freedom under the cover of darkness. They were developing their own airborne radars, like the Liechtenstein system, but its deployment lagged behind the British efforts. More importantly, they hadn't yet faced the technological leap that was just around the corner, a leap that would render their existing countermeasures obsolete and dramatically shift the balance of power in the night war. The pre-Magnetron era of radar, characterized by chain home, GCI, and early AI, had been a period of rapid, reactive development. It had saved Britain in 1940 and provided the first glimmers of hope against the Blitz. But its limitations were clear. A breakthrough was needed, something that could generate powerful radar pulses at much shorter wavelengths, offering greater precision, smaller antennas, and resistance to jamming. The scientists knew what was needed, the question was, how to build it. It's easy to look back now and see the clear progression of technology, the inevitable march towards smaller, more powerful radar. But in the midst of the war, it was anything but clear. The limitations of meter-wavelength radar were deeply frustrating for both the operators on the ground and the aircrews risking their lives in the night sky. Chain home and the early GCI systems, while revolutionary for their time, simply couldn't provide the fine detail needed. Think about trying to distinguish individual aircraft within a large formation using radar waves that were several feet long. It's like trying to identify different types of pebbles using only your fist. The resolution just wasn't there. Similarly, the airborne interception sets, constrained by the need for large antennas due to their 1.5 meter wavelength, imposed significant aerodynamic penalties on the fighters carrying them. They slowed the aircraft down and made them less maneuverable. More critically, these long wavelengths were relatively easy for the Germans to detect and eventually jam. As the war progressed, German bombers began carrying devices like METOX, which could pick up the signals from British AI radar, giving the bomber crew a warning that they were being hunted. This electronic game of cat and mouse was constantly escalating. The British scientists knew the solution lay in moving to much shorter wavelengths, specifically, centimeter wavelengths. Radar operating in the centimeter band, microwaves, would offer dramatically improved resolution, allowing operators to distinguish individual targets more clearly. It would also enable the use of much smaller antennas, small enough to fit neatly into the nosecone of a fighter or even onto a rotating scanner dish on a ship or submarine, without significant drag penalties. And perhaps most importantly, at that time, the Germans had no equipment capable of detecting or effectively jamming centimeter wave radar. It would be like introducing a completely invisible detection method. The problem was generating powerful radio pulses at these incredibly high frequencies. Existing vacuum tube technology, like the triodes and klystrons used in meter wavelength radar, became highly inefficient at generating significant power in the centimeter band. They simply couldn't oscillate fast enough or handle the power levels required for effective radar range. It seemed like a fundamental roadblock. Scientists were experimenting with various approaches, but progress was slow. It felt like they were hitting a wall. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn, involving two physicists at the University of Birmingham, John Randall and Harry Boot. Working under the guidance of Professor Mark Oliphant, they weren't initially focused solely on radar. They were exploring ways to generate microwaves for potential use in communications or other applications. Building on earlier, less successful designs for resonant cavity devices, they came up with a radical new idea in late 1939 and early 1940. Instead of a complex linear arrangement like a klystron, they designed a solid block of copper with a series of precisely machined resonant cavities arranged in a circle around a central cathode. Electrons emitted from the cathode would be forced into a circular path by a powerful magnet and interact with the cavities, causing them to resonate and generate microwave oscillations of astonishing power. It was, in essence, a high-power microwave whistle. In February 1940, Randall and Boot tested their first prototype. The results were astounding, almost unbelievable. This small, relatively simple device produced microwave pulses at a wavelength of around 10 centimeters with power levels hundreds, even thousands, of times greater than any previous microwave generator. It was the breakthrough everyone had been searching for, but perhaps hadn't quite known how to achieve. This device was the cavity magnetron. Its invention wasn't the end of the pre-Magnetron era, but its beginning marked the imminent transformation of radar technology. News of this incredible device spread rapidly within the highly secret British scientific community. Its potential for radar was immediately recognized. Here was the key to unlocking centimeter-wave radar, the technology needed to overcome the limitations of the existing systems, to truly see in the dark, and to counter German countermeasures. But building a prototype in a lab is one thing, turning it into a rugged, reliable device that could be mass-produced and installed in aircraft, ships, and ground stations during wartime is another challenge entirely. This critical next step involved intense collaboration, engineering prowess, and a pivotal transatlantic partnership. The Nazis might have laughed at the early, clumsy attempts at detection, but they were completely unaware of the revolution that was quietly being born in a British university laboratory. This tiny copper block held the potential to change the course of the war in the air, at sea, and ultimately, on land. The era before the magnetron was drawing to a close, defined by ingenuity born of necessity, but also by limitations that were about to be spectacularly overcome. The laughter was long gone, soon to be replaced by shock and disbelief as Allied radar took an evolutionary leap forward, leaving German countermeasures far behind. The period before the widespread deployment of the cavity magnetron wasn't just about technological struggle, it was profoundly shaped by the human element. The operators, the plotters, the controllers, the mechanics, they were the hidden figures making these early systems work, often through sheer ingenuity and tireless effort. Let's revisit those chain-home radar huts. The WWII operators staring at the A-scope displays weren't just passively watching blips. They were actively interpreting ambiguous signals. They learned to recognize the subtle differences between the echo from a large bomber formation and interference caused by weather or even flocks of birds. They developed techniques to estimate raid size based on the width and intensity of the blip, skills honed through hours of practice and real-world experience. A slight waver, a momentary flicker, these could hold vital clues. Their reports, phoned through to the filter rooms, were the first crucial link in the chain. If you appreciate hearing about the unsung heroes behind the technology, maybe share this video with someone who'd feel the same. Inside the filter rooms, often located in underground bunkers, another group, again largely WWII personnel, faced a different kind of pressure. They stood around large plotting tables, receiving reports from multiple radar stations simultaneously. Each station might give slightly different information on range, bearing, and altitude. The plotters had to quickly synthesize this often conflicting data, place markers on the map grid representing enemy formations, and update their positions as new reports came in. Overseeing them were filter officers, typically RAF personnel, who had the critical task of deciding which radar plots were reliable, which might be spurious echoes or ghosts, and forming a coherent picture of the air situation. They recognized their picture. They had to make rapid judgments. Is this one large raid or two smaller ones? Are they heading for London or turning towards the coast? Is that altitude reading accurate? Errors could mean fighters scrambled too late, or sent to the wrong location, with potentially fatal consequences. It was high-stakes pattern recognition and decision-making under extreme stress. Then came the sector controllers, operating from similar underground control rooms. Receiving the filtered plot data, they had the responsibility of allocating RAF fighter squadrons to intercept the incoming raids. They needed intimate knowledge of their sector, the status and location of their squadrons, on the ground, airborne, refueling, the performance characteristics of Hurricanes versus Spitfires, and the likely intentions of the enemy. Their communication with the pilots, guiding them towards the enemy based on the radar picture, had to be clear, concise, and accurate. Think of the controller trying to guide a pilot through thick cloud or darkness towards an unseen enemy, relying solely on the blips provided by a GCI station miles away. Turn starboard now, vector 090, bandit closing, range 3 miles, slightly above you. The trust between controller and pilot was absolute. And let's not forget the technicians and mechanics who kept these complex, temperamental systems running. Early radar equipment, filled with vacuum tubes and high-voltage components, was prone to failure. Maintaining the massive chain-home towers, often in harsh coastal weather, calibrating the sensitive receivers, troubleshooting faulty circuits in a cramped GCI trailer or the even tighter confines of an AI-equipped night fighter, this required immense skill and dedication. They were often working under pressure, needing to get vital equipment back online as quickly as possible, sometimes while air raids were in progress. This human network, operators, filterers, controllers, mechanics, and aircrews adapting to the new technology, was the software that made the hardware function. The Nazis had underestimated the hardware, yes, but they perhaps underestimated the resilience and adaptability of this human system even more. The British weren't just building radar stations, they were building an integrated air defense system where technology and people worked together, learning and adapting under fire. This ability to improvise and learn was crucial. When the Germans introduced jamming or new tactics, the British system had to adapt. Operators learned to recognize the signs of jamming on their screens. Scientists worked frantically to develop countermeasures. New procedures were developed in the filter rooms and control centers. It was a constant cycle of action, reaction, and innovation, driven by the people on the front lines. The pre-Magnetron era, therefore, wasn't just about the limitations of the technology, it was also about the remarkable human ability to extract maximum value from that limited technology. The Nazis had focused heavily on the perceived technical shortcomings, failing to appreciate the strength of the integrated system and the determination of the people operating it. This human dimension, the quiet, persistent effort in darkened rooms and windy airfields, was an essential ingredient in turning the tide against the Luftwaffe, long before their magic of the magnetron arrived. So, reflecting on this period, what are the key takeaways from the Nazi underestimation of this early, pre-magnetron detection technology? It wasn't just a single mistake, but a series of interconnected failures in intelligence, strategy, and mindset. Firstly, there was a failure of technical intelligence assessment. While aware of British radar development, German intelligence reports consistently downplayed its effectiveness. They focused on its technical limitations, the poor resolution, the difficulties in height finding, the susceptibility to jamming, without fully appreciating its strategic impact as an integrated system. They saw the pieces but missed the picture. They didn't grasp how even imperfect early warning, when coupled with a well-organized fighter control system, could negate much of the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage and element of surprise. This highlights a timeless lesson: judging technology solely on its raw specifications without considering how it's used within a larger system can lead to critical miscalculations. Secondly, there was a strategic blindness born from an overwhelmingly offensive doctrine. The Luftwaffe was built for blitzkrieg, for rapid, decisive attacks. Investment and attention flowed towards bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts. Defensive thinking was secondary. The idea that a defensive system like radar could significantly blunt their offensive power simply didn't fit their worldview. This offensive bias made them less inclined to prioritize the destruction of the radar network during the Battle of Britain and slower to develop effective countermeasures. They were trying to kick down the door without realizing the doorframe was much stronger than they thought, thanks to the radar eyes watching them approach. Thirdly, there was an element of pure arrogance and complacency. Göring's boasts about the Luftwaffe's invincibility and the perceived weakness of British defences fostered an environment where inconvenient intelligence about radar's effectiveness might have been ignored or downplayed. There was a belief in German technological superiority that made it hard to accept that the British could have developed something genuinely impactful, even if it seemed crude. This kind of hubris is a recurring theme in military history, the powerful incumbent underestimating the disruptive potential of a new, seemingly inferior technology or tactic. They laughed because it didn't look like their advanced technology, it looked different, clunkier, less refined, and therefore, they assumed, less effective. The consequences of this underestimation were profound. In the Battle of Britain, it cost the Luftwaffe air superiority and ultimately led to the cancellation of the invasion of Britain. It allowed the RAF to survive and fight another day, a crucial turning point in the war. During the Blitz, while early radar couldn't stop the night bombers entirely, the developing GCI and AI systems, born from the foundations laid by Chain Home, began to inflict losses and force the Luftwaffe to divert resources, eventually contributing to the decline of the strategic bombing campaign against Britain. More broadly, the failure to prioritize counter-radar measures early on meant that when the Allies did introduce the revolutionary cavity magnetron and centimeter-wave radar, the Germans were caught completely off guard, with devastating consequences in the Battle of the Atlantic against U-boats, in the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, and on the battlefields after D-Day. Their initial dismissal of radar created a technological gap that they struggled, and ultimately failed, to close. The story serves as a powerful reminder: never underestimate your opponent, especially their ability to innovate under pressure. Don't let your own strengths or doctrines blind you to the potential impact of seemingly unconventional or imperfect technologies. And recognize that technology alone isn't the whole story. How it's integrated into a system and utilized by determined people can be just as, if not more, important. The laughter of the Nazi high command in the face of Chain Home echoes through history as a warning about the perils of arrogance and the unpredictable power of innovation, even when it comes in the form of clumsy towers and flickering green lines. The era before the magnetron wasn't a time of failure for Allied detection tech, it was a time of crucial learning, adaptation, and survival against the odds, setting the stage for even greater technological triumphs to come. Looking back at this critical phase of technological warfare, it becomes clear just how pivotal those early, often frustrating years of radar development were. The pre-Magnetron systems, Chain Home, GCI, early AI, they weren't the final answer, but they were the absolutely essential first steps. They bought Britain time, saved fighter command from annihilation, and provided the crucial operational experience needed to rapidly exploit the cavity magnetron when it arrived. The Nazis' failure to appreciate this, their dismissal of the early systems as primitive toys, was a strategic blunder of the first order. It stemmed from a combination of factors we've discussed: flawed intelligence, an offensive-heavy doctrine that undervalued defensive measures, and a dangerous dose of hubris. They saw the technical limitations but missed the systemic strength and the human ingenuity making it work. That laughter, that underestimation, allowed the Allies to build experience, refine tactics, and crucially, keep fighting long enough for the game-changing technology of the magnetron to emerge from the labs. When centimeter-wave radar finally appeared, deployed through the TISARD mission's sharing of technology with the United States ensuring mass production, it hit the Axis powers like a bolt from the blue, precisely because they hadn't taken the earlier, meter-wave systems seriously enough to develop broad countermeasures or truly understand the underlying principles. They were caught years behind in a crucial technological race. This history holds lessons that resonate even today. In any field, whether military, business, or technology, dismissing early or seemingly crude innovations because they don't fit your current paradigm can be incredibly costly. Understanding not just the technology itself, but how it integrates into a larger system and how people adapt to use it, is vital. The story of what happened when the Nazis laughed at early detection tech is a powerful reminder that sometimes, the things that seem easiest to dismiss are the very things that end up changing everything. We hope this journey back to the early days of radar has been insightful. If you found value in understanding how these historical moments unfolded, perhaps hitting the like button would let us know. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to sharing more history with you soon.